Hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is for my AP Biology class. Part of their lecture is given online. So this is Chapter 32, Circulation and Cardiovascular Systems, and you want to check Google Classroom because you might also have an associated Edpuzzle. So as far as our notes go for in class under Chapter 32, this first section is about invertebrates, and then we will focus on 32.2 with vertebrates. And then in class, I will discuss 32.3, the human cardiovascular system. And then in this presentation, I will also discuss 32.4, blood. All right, good to go. You got your group shared notes out. Let me start with the very first part. And this part you need to type in your notes. Circulatory system defined. Ready? Moves fluid that contains oxygen and nutrients throughout the body while also removing waste products. Moves fluid that contains oxygen and nutrients throughout the body while also removing waste products. And we're going to look at variations on that theme. So we can start with single-celled organisms. They can use their cell membrane to meet all of their needs. They can exchange oxygen and CO2, nutrients and waste right across their cell membrane. And then things like the streaming of the cytoplasm can move what they need around as well. Okay, as far as circulatory systems, some organisms have them, some don't. So we can see some Cnidaria up here at the top left does not have a circulatory system, and we do, and we will look at variations on that. Your next part of your notes talks about small flat organisms don't need a circulatory system. Instead, they will use their gastrovascular cavity. So here, the Cnidaria in the top left-hand corner uses its gastrovascular cavity. Now, there are three types of worms you're seeing here. Flatworms and like Platyhelminthes. And if you look at this structure here on the left, okay, this centermost tube right there in the center, that would be their gut tube. And then the blue is going to be endoderm, and it's, mesoderm, and it's going to be solid. And then the red out here would be coming from ectoderm. And they will do, if they're really small, thin, and flat, they can do all their exchange right across the outermost parts of their body. They're thin enough that everything will diffuse through. Now, nematodes, which we would see here in the second one, they have this body cavity right through here. That's called a pseudocoelom. I don't want you to stress out about that, but it is a body cavity that is not completely lined with mesoderm. Let's compare it here to annelid, a segmented worm. This is a true coelomated organism because it has its gut tube here in yellow, but in this light blue space, that's its true coelom. The blue is mesoderm, and this body cavity here in the center is completely surrounded with that blue. Okay, so that's called a coelomated organism. If you compare it here to the roundworm in the middle, you have mesoderm here, but you don't have any mesoderm in this area. So that's why it's called a pseudocoelom. Then this flatworm is referred to as being acoelomated. What do you need to walk away with from there? That these, whether it's a pseudocoelom or a true coelomated organism, fluids might be moving within that coelom. Okay, so here's your definition of a coelom. Let me get the notes off, hang on there. So you can see the gut tube, and you can see some mesoderm. That's the reddish color here is the mesoderm right here, and this is mesoderm. So you, this type of organism has a tube within a tube, this gut tube within this bigger coelomated tube. So fluids can sit within that coelom. So if you go to your group shared notes, you'll see pseudocoelomated invertebrates use coelemic fluid of their body. And then I gave an example, so do echinoderms and starfish who are also coelomated. So this one has no coelom, okay? And Planaria right here has no coelom, and so the diffusion just goes right across their outer surface of their body. This nematode here, the second wormy looking one here, uses its coelomic fluid to move, its coelomic cavity to move fluid. Echinoderms have a special, what's called water vascular system, and you can see a better picture of it here, also to move fluids. And the big picture here is these fluids could have nutrients, waste, oxygen, carbon dioxide in them, and you have to have a way to circulate them throughout an entire multicellular organisms. So you can use a system or you can use a body cavity. And there are two types of fluids that get moved around. So if you look on your notes, this is number 4, 2 types of circulatory fluids. One is blood, and if you refer to it as blood, like you and I have blood, that means it always stays within blood vessels, always stays within blood vessels. But then there is another type of fluid that can circulate around, and that's called hemolymph. And this is blood and a mixture of what you would, it's called interstitial fluid, but it's like a tissue fluid, and it's found inside the coelom. So look here, okay? Interstitial fluid defined, I know you can read this. The fluid found in the intercellular space is composed of water, amino acids, sugars, etc., and cellular products. It bathes and surrounds the cells of the body and provides a means of delivering materials to the cells. So let me give you an example. You and I have a closed circulatory system, like this earthworm on the right, meaning all of our fluid stays in our blood vessels and we call it blood. A second type of fluid that you're looking at right here is this interstitial fluid, okay, referred to as hemolymph, interstitial fluid plus blood. And what happens here, when you look at the grasshopper, he has a heart that's running up the back here. Let me get a better picture, a better color. And he has a heart right through here. And what happens is he gathers that hemolymph in this long tubular vessel that runs along dorsally. Then he squirts the fluid out by his the anterior end, and then it just kind of oozes through his body. So it doesn't stay inside of a vessel all of the time. That's referred to as an open circulatory system. So let's go back here again and look at this one more time. So when you refer to these two fluids, blood's always in a blood vessel like you and I. The only time it's not in a blood vessel is when we get a bruise. Hemolymph, it might be in part of a vessel at part of the time. It might be kind of oozing through the spaces of the body the other time. So it's a mixture of blood and interstitial fluid. So put your definitions down there for number 4. Fluid always remains within blood vessels, and hemolymph is a mixture of blood and interstitial fluid. Fluid found in the open spaces of the body. The next section in your notes talks about the open and closed, which I've already referred to. So open circulatory systems, like what you would see here on the left, evolved first. You see them in mollusks and arthropods, like insects and arachnids. And they do use the hemolymph for nutrient and waste transport. Now let's talk about the gases. Now, grasshoppers have spiracles that run along the sides of their body. And instead of like you and I, where the air goes in and out of our mouth, they have these little holes running along the length of their body. And their tracheal system is branching tubules that go in and become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And it reaches these little tubes reach every single cell in their body. So their gas exchange will take place through these tubules that run in and out of their body. Not like you and I, where our blood comes in and around our lungs and picks up the gases and transports it to other places in our bodies. Whereas the grasshopper has tubes going to every cell in their body, and that's their tracheal system. So when you look at number 1, use hemolymph underneath the open circulatory system for nutrient and waste transport. Gas is transported by other tubes. So their blood is colorless, whereas our blood is pigmented, and it's red most of the time, and because it's carrying oxygen. So their heart sucks hemolymph back into it and pumps it through the spaces. A closed circulatory system. blood remains within blood vessels. Most tissues are not far from a capillary. A capillary is where all exchange takes place. And then within those systems, the valves prevent backflow. So when you look at our heart, okay, what you want to remember is that arteries always, hang on just a second, pin. Okay, arteries, by definition, always go away from a heart. It doesn't matter if the blood is oxygenated or deoxygenated, arteries go away from a heart. And veins always go towards a heart. So little teeny tiny arteries are called arteriole arteries. Little teeny tiny veins are called venules. So we're at the junction where an arteriole meets a venule, that's where you have capillaries. And it's at the capillary level for an organism like us with a closed circulatory system where all exchange takes place. And the reason is capillaries are one cell thick. Okay, so I'm going to break that down by your notes. That was a little bit of an overview. So when we start, if you look at this diagram on the left here, we have arteries. And I want you to pay attention to the differences between an artery and a vein. The opening, an opening like this is called a lumen. And if you compare the size of the lumen in the veins is bigger. If you compare the muscle in the walls of the vessel, the arteries has thicker muscles, the vein has fewer. Also, you can see valves that are here in the vein. So we have arteries becoming branching into arterioles, which branch into the arteriole into the capillary bed, venule into the capillary bed. Venules start coming together to form veins. Again, definition, arteries go away, veins go towards. So looking at your notes, here is a cross-section of an artery. The function is to take, and I'm at section 32.2, an artery takes blood away from the heart. Takes blood away from the heart. On its structure, thick muscular walls. Thick muscular walls. And arterioles are the smallest arteries. Smallest arteries. Let's talk about why does it make sense? Why would you have thick muscular walls in the arteries? Remember, arteries are going where? Away from the heart. So they're going to have the greatest force as the heart contracts and shoots that blood out the arteries. At first your aorta, right? And we'll break that down later in class. And so they have to withstand that pressure. So they need to have those thick muscular walls that can snap out, take the pressure and snap back and facilitate keeping that blood go in one direction. All right, now if you would pay attention to the innermost lining, okay, that I'm trying to color here in yellow, the innermost lining of the artery is called the endothelium. As the arteries get smaller and smaller and smaller and become arterioles and then eventually become, so arteries getting smaller, arterioles, and eventually become capillaries. Capillaries are only made of the endothelium, that lining we saw on the artery. They are one cell thick. And any exchange of oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide waste is going to go across the one cell thick walled capillaries. And we'll talk about the dynamics of how it goes across in just a little bit, but you know it could go between, kind of like if I were talking about a plant, it could be going between the cells, so that would be like the apoplast, or it could be going through like the symplast, right, when we talked about roots. But we have two pressures at work at a capillary. Hydrostatic pressure that's always forcing fluids out, and osmotic pressure that's always forcing fluids back in. And whatever is left over becomes part of our lymphatic system as our lymph vessels pick that up. And I'll hit that a little bit later. But that's a dynamic exchange, and only there at capillaries Do you have that exchange? And every cell in your body is going to need oxygen, and it's going to need nutrients, and it's going to need to get its waste removed. So every cell in your body has to be near a capillary in order to function. So for your definition for capillaries, all exchange of gases and nutrients and waste. All exchange of gases, nutrients, and waste. For your structure, it's one cell thick. One cell thick, and that's called endothelium. Endothelium. And you have that written for you right here. Endothelium. All right, and if all your capillary beds were open at the same time throughout your body, there wouldn't be enough blood to go around, and your blood pressure would drop and you would pass out. So you're constantly opening and closing capillary beds and shunting blood to different locations. All right, so artery, arteriole, capillaries in the middle, coming back in a venule and a vein. Now, this is where the blood pressure is going to be the lowest, okay, because you have to go from a higher blood pressure to a lower blood pressure. And so to facilitate it coming back to your heart, you're going to need something in place to keep it going. So one of those, what kind of helps keep pushing the blood through the veins are your skeletal muscles contracting and pushing on the vein walls. And because there are valves, and let's go in here, because there are valves inside the veins, it keeps the blood going in one direction because those are one-way valves. So as the muscle is contracting right here, okay, the blood can only move in one direction. Also, your breathing motions help facilitate that process as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the importance of valves, it keeps blood going in the same direction. Because the blood is not moving as quickly as it's moving in an artery, you need to have more space to keep the volume the same between your arteries and your veins, so their lumen is a little bit bigger. The blood is not under the same type of pressure in an artery, so you don't need to have those muscular walls like you do in an artery. And here you can see a cross section, you can see a vein, and it's much, much larger in a lumen and artery, but yet thicker walls right here. All right, so on your vein, the function, it takes blood towards the heart, Its structure, larger lumen and valves that prevent backflow. Larger lumen and valves that prevent backflow. And venules are the smallest veins. Venules are the smallest veins. Right, and a quick comparison between different organisms. If you look at the fish, this is simple, okay? Their heart consists of a single atrium. An atrium is something that's gathering the blood. The ventricle is pumping, and when it pumps, it sends it to its gills. And the gills is where you're going to have exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So it's going to pick up oxygen. That's why it appears red in this picture. Now, something that people sometimes confuse is they think blood is blue and blood is red. They're just doing that to simplify the diagrams. Your blood is never blue. It just kind of appears blue through the discoloration of your tissues above your veins, like in your arm. So if people always ask me, if you bleed in space and it goes out into, will it be blue? No. Okay, it's either oxygenated or it becomes like a deep, darker red, but not ever the blue. Okay. So fish, they pick up and they have their oxygenated blood, and then they're going to go and take that oxygenated blood from their gills throughout their entire body. But notice if they've got one pump, here's their pump right here, their ventricle is pumping one time through, and it's going to slow down. The time when the blood moves the slowest is through the capillaries. So it's going to gather a little bit of speed as the capillaries come together, and you have your larger vessels here in your aorta, but then it's got to make its way through a second set of capillaries, a single pump system. And in your notes you see one circuit, single loop, single atrium, single ventricle, to gills, gas exchange, aorta, systemic circulation, and atrium again. Okay, a two-circuit situation here where look at the first scenario, we have a ventricle, a single ventricle, but we have two different atria, and there is quite a bit of mixing of blood because we only have a single pump. This would be most reptiles and amphibians work this way, and obviously it's adaptive for them. Amphibians, it helps because they have thin, moist skin, and some gas exchange could occur across their thin, moist skin just like it would a worm. Okay? So what happens in this situation is the blood that's coming back from their systemic, their body cells, it's deoxygenated. It's going to come back to their atria right here and move into their ventricle. The next place it needs to go, it's deoxygenated, is it needs to go to the lungs in order to get oxygenated. And so it does that, but when it comes back and it's coming back from the lungs and the capillaries, it goes back into that same pump. So you're using the same pump whether you're pumping blood to the body or you're pumping blood to the lungs, and that's why you see that mixing of blood. Now for us, mammals, that's not going to work for us. Our metabolism is very, as mammals, is very rapid. We have high demands for oxygen. Our bodies can't tolerate those low levels of oxygen, so we have 4 chambers. So we have a 4-chambered heart. So blood, deoxygenated blood coming back from our bodies, it's going to go into our right atrium, down into our right ventricle, and out to our lungs, come back into our left atrium and left ventricle. There's no mixing of blood. So it's in mammals, birds, crocodiles, you have 2 atria and 2 ventricles, no mixing of blood. No mixing of blood for mammals. But the one above that for reptiles and amphibian, 2 atria, 1 ventricle, and you have some mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. All right, so that takes you through 31.1 and 32.2. So you're going to skip over in your notes and pick up at 32.4, because the rest we will do in this whole section you're seeing go by here. We're going to discuss in class. And I'm going to pick up right here at the last section, 32.4, talking about blood. So how blood of mammals helps maintain homeostasis. So I have a little chart for you here. And I know that you can read through this chart independently, but we'll identify 5 things that we want to pay special attention to. So one way blood helps maintain homeostasis for mammals is transporting gases and nutrients and waste products and hormones throughout our body. It has, number 2, combating pathogenic microorganisms. So it's a vehicle along with our lymphatic system to transport white blood cells to help us fight off infections. Number 3, and you need to fill this part in your notes. Number 3, it helps maintain water balance and pH. Water balance and pH. 4, by regulating body temperature, regulating our body temperature. 5, carrying platelets and factors that ensure clotting to prevent blood loss. And in your notes, you may want to capture that image right there. Keep in mind, this whole presentation is going to be in your Google Drive, so you can grab any of these pictures that you want. All right, so what's in blood? Let's go over blood contents. Okay, so if you took your blood and you would spin it in a centrifuge, less than half of it would actually be red blood cells. More than half would be plasma, which would be the liquid portion, the matrix that this connective tissue sits in. And most of that plasma is actually water. And then you can see a small percentage here are white blood cells and platelets. So plasma, 90 to 92% of it is water, but you have other items dissolved in it: proteins, salts, gases, nutrients, nitrogenous waste, hormones and vitamins. And in class, I'll give you a way to remember what types of things are found in plasma. And I have that is all at the top of your notes. Red blood cells also and white blood cells are found in your blood, obviously the formed elements. And red blood cells contain hemoglobin and function in oxygen transport. Contain hemoglobin and function in oxygen transport. And we can see in this picture, though they don't look very red, okay, you can see where the red blood cells are here, biconcave discs. Neutrophils are like the policemen of your immune system. We'll be talking about that later. Platelets are involved in blood clotting. Lymphocytes, you'll have two different types that we'll be talking about later in our immune system. Eosinophils, monocyte is a type of white blood cell as well. Basophil secretes histamine. Also mast cells in your tissues also secrete histamine, and some of you have allergies because you get too much histamine that is secreted, so you take an antihistamine. We'll be talking about that shortly. So red blood cells and white blood cells. Here you can see red blood cells moving through a capillary, coming a little bit closer, and then inside that red blood cell takes us to, contains hemoglobin and functions in oxygen transport, that section, because each of these hemoglobin molecules can hang on to one oxygen molecule. So you could have an oxygen and an oxygen. And you have about 250 million molecules of hemoglobin within every red blood cell. So you can carry about 1 billion oxygen molecules in every single red blood cell. Okay, also, let's see, moving on, your stem cells in your bone marrow, they are going to break down and form two categories, myeloid stem cells and lymphatic stem cells. Do not let this diagram stress you out. We will be talking about all of the white blood cells, including your lymphocytes, your B and T lymphocytes. We'll talk about all of this section right here when we discuss the immune system. Just for right now, you're going to know that white blood cells fight infection, and you're going to know that red blood cells are carrying oxygen, and you're going to know that platelets are involved in blood clotting. Okay, so don't stress out too much about that. But I want to, you have already in red blood cells about the APBio system. You know about that from our genetics unit and the RH system. White blood cells, their function, it protects the body from invasion by foreign substances and organisms. I'm trying to keep this under 30. Function protects body from invasion by foreign substances and organisms. And some can be phagocytic, and you know what that means, and they're going to engulf. Others produce antibodies, and others do cell-to-cell combat. All right, and our last one is on platelets. There are over 12 different clotting factors that work with platelets. It's a series of reactions to trigger a clot, because you don't want to inadvertently trigger a clot and cause a stroke or something in your brain. So platelets, there are over 12 different clotting factors that work with platelets. The process, platelets are at the wound, and with damaged tissue, start an enzymatic process ending with, and here you can see the wound, okay? And platelets are at that area trying to form a plug, and you have prothrombin activator along with calcium, you have to have that, converts prothrombin to thrombin. Then this thrombin, along with calcium, will make fibrinogen, form these fibrin threads. And these fibrin threads go across the wound. The red blood cells get stuck in them, and then when they do that, they can form a clot. Okay, so that B process, platelets at wound with damaged tissue start enzymatic process ending with fibrin threads forming a framework for a clot. If you have trouble clotting your blood, it's referred to as hemophilia, an inherited clotting disorder. Okay, you're almost done. Moving on to blood flow. So here we're looking at a capillary bed. Over here you have an arteriole, and this arteriole is branching off, okay, into the arteries, and then we have veins, or sorry, the venular end of the capillary bed rejoining to form venules, and then eventually veins. At the capillary bed, due to the force of the heart, fluid is under pressure at the arterial end, and it's forcing fluids out. And those fluids are carrying, generally speaking, if we're out in a body system, we'll talk about differences in other places, but if we're, let's say, out at your big toe, it's going to force oxygen and nutrients out. That blood pressure to go out is greater than the osmotic pressure to come in at the arterial end, of the capillary bed. You know about osmotic pressure. Think about hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic. So because there are a lot of different items dissolved in your blood, fluid wants to go in. At the arterial end, the blood pressure wins out. The hydrostatic pressure is greatest, so fluid goes out. But by the time you get to the venular end, the blood pressure has dropped considerably, and the osmotic pressure to draw in then brings in the fluid. And what's coming with this fluid is the CO2 and the waste. Whatever doesn't get picked up by the venular end of the capillary bed, that's what gets picked up by your lymphatic system, and it's going to go through a lymph node and get returned to you at your subclavian vein after it's been monitored for any kind of diseases. So when we look here, take a look at this picture, we can see your artery, an arteriole, and your capillary bed. At this end of your capillary bed, the out pressure wins. So out comes the oxygen, out comes the nutrients. By the time you get to the venular end, the osmotic pressure, due to the substances in the blood, draw fluid back in. They're drawing back in the CO2. They're drawing back in the waste. Whatever doesn't get picked up by the venular end, that's where the lymphatic system is going to pick it up. So again, one more time, looking at from the arterial end to the venular end, and imagining here in the middle, this is your capillary bed. Hydrostatic pressure due to the heart is going to force fluids out, water, oxygen, amino acids, glucose. But by the time the blood has got here to the venular end, the osmotic pressure is greater, and it's going to draw in carbon dioxide and waste and water. So it can be returned, go back to your heart, get sent to the kidney and be cleaned of nitrogenous waste, or go to the liver and be cleaned of toxins. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in class. One last diagram to help you with that. Arterial end, venular end. Where you're seeing the heart, right here, the hydrostatic pressure, it's greatest at the arterial end, and the hydrostatic pressure goes down, 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 the farther it gets away from the heart. So at this point, it's equal to the osmotic pressure, but as the blood continues to travel, the osmotic pressure is greater, and it draws the fluid back in. So let's look at that on our notes. Okay, on number 2, capillaries exchange. Oh, let me back up. Blood flow. Sorry. Arteries due to force on blood by the heart, blood pressure falls the farther the distance from the heart. Blood pressure falls the farther the distance from the heart. Capillaries. You have an exchange as a result of 2 opposite pressures. Hydrostatic pressure is out. It's due to the heart. It's stronger at the arterial end of the capillaries. At the arterial end of the capillaries, and it forces nutrients and oxygen out. Forces nutrients and oxygen out. The osmotic pressure is due to the contents of the capillaries. It is stronger than the hydrostatic pressure at the venular end of the capillaries, and it draws waste and carbon dioxide in. Waste and carbon dioxide back in. All right, and your very last box, cardiovascular disease. The first one is hypertension, and hypertension is basically known as high blood pressure. Atherosclerosis is when you have plaques inside your arterial walls and it makes the opening smaller, so your heart has to be harder in order to get the blood through. So plaque buildup on arterial walls. So you can have hypertension as a result of atherosclerosis. Now, due to high blood pressure, what you might end up getting is a stroke in your brain, where a blood vessel, due to the force on the blood due to your heart, that a portion of the brain dies due to a blood clot or a vessel burst. And then there are aneurysm, and I'm just going to keep in the brain. I'll come back to the heart in just a minute here. An aneurysm, you can have this ballooning due to this high blood pressure, and then it could actually burst. So an aneurysm is a ballooning of a blood vessel. And then a heart attack, you have that already. A blood clot in the coronary artery, which basically, if you've gotten a leg cramp, get one in your heart, and then you know what a heart attack is a little bit like. How can you avoid this? Don't do these things. Don't eat a lot of fatty foods. Don't smoke. Don't be overweight. And then positive, do these things. Exercise, regular visits to the doctor, and eat healthy foods. Okay, you're super smart. I'm already proud of you. Make sure you get all your notes and do your ed puzzle.